In August of 1908, Peter Haynes, an Army captain and son of a distinguished Army general, shot Wilmer Annis, a newspaper executive and member of the New York social scene, in a shocking, cold-blooded murder in broad daylight in full view of the public. The murder at the Regatta was a story of jealousy, of passion, some would say of insanity, that fascinated the nation and changed the very way that we view and prosecute murder in the United States. It is history that deserves to be remembered.
Peter Conover Haynes, Jr. was part of a military family. His father, Peter Sr., had fought in the Civil War, firing the first cannon shot fired by Union artillery at Bull Run. The elder Haynes made a career as a military engineer and had overseen the construction of Washington, D.C.'s Tidal Basin, which sits near the National Mall. He had served in both the Civil War and the Spanish-American War, and came out of retirement to serve in the First World War as well. Peter Jr. was born on January 9, 1872, and followed his father into the military, as did one of his two brothers. A younger brother, Thornton Jenkins Haynes, was a successful author, writing adventure novels and short stories in New York magazines. The Chicago Daily Tribune reports that Peter Jr. was educated at the Naval Academy at Annapolis, but that he dropped from the Navy because of poor sight. He was commissioned into the Army in July of 1898 to serve in the Spanish-American War. Peter married 16-year-old Claudia Libby, 12 years his junior, in April 1900 in Massachusetts. They soon befriended another couple, William Elmer Annis and his wife Helen, who had married the same year. Annis was the advertising manager for a popular magazine, the Burr Macintosh Monthly. The Annises would have 2 children, while the Haynes would have 4 over the next 8 years. The Haynes transferred several times with the Army, but remained close with the Annises. They were still friends as late as 1907, when Peter was sent to the Philippines with the transfer service. An article in the D.C. Evening Star quotes Lieutenant Colonel Ludlow, in command of Fort Hamilton, that Haynes had left his car with Annis and asked him to use it as if it were his own. And he also asked that he come to the fort and take Mrs. Haynes out driving once in a while. But things were not as smooth as they seemed. While they were still living in Virginia, Peter's brother Thornton, usually called by his middle name Jenkins, warned him that William Annis visited Claudia while Peter was away. Jenkins would later claim he had known of the affair as early as 1903. But the issue came to a head in 1908 when Peter was in the Philippines. Jenkins sent letters to his brother in March, warning him again that there was something amiss and that Mrs. Annis had sent him letters intimating that Claudia and William Annis were having an affair. Worse, letters from Claudia had stopped arriving around the same time. Peter abruptly left the Philippines, arriving in San Francisco. There he said, "I found a big bundle of letters from Claudia, and after reading them I was convinced that there was something wrong, and I hurried east as quickly as I could." It's not clear why the letters had failed to reach Peter in the Pacific, but the contents apparently crazed Peter, rather than reassuring him. Among the missives, she mentioned meeting Billy Annis, and teased her husband to see what you are missing by not being with your sporty wife. On April 4th, she said that she and Annis had went to the Fifth Avenue Hotel to take our last drink as it was to be torn down. She ended the letters invariably with loving farewells, "My darling husband and your most loving wife." When he confronted Claudia on his return, she denied any impropriety.
It seemed like the whole thing had blown over. The 4 of them met that night for a drive to Coney Island, where Annis was pulled over for speeding.
Jenkins, however, thought that his brother was being a fool, and told him, "For God's sake, wake up!" Peter took heed, bursting into his wife's room to charge her of infidelity. Under his furious questioning, she admitted that in a week-long absence that Jenkins had reported that she had been in a Manhattan apartment with Annis. He forced her to sign a confession of infidelity in front of a lawyer, naming Annis as her seducer. The confession contained 8 or 9 specific acts between Peter's leaving for Manila in October 1907 and his return the following May. Haynes claimed she told him that she had been infatuated with William E. Annis in the entire period of 6 to 8 years of her married life. Claudia later gave a different story, claiming that Jenkins was an arch-fiend plotting to ruin her marriage, and that Peter had been poisoned by his words. She said the confession had been made by threats, drugs, and whiskey, and that she had been isolated, beaten, and denied food for 2 days. She also claimed that she wasn't even allowed to read the contents of the document that they made her sign. Divorce proceedings began in June, and the fight was messy and often public. Claudia accused Peter of perversion, saying that she had caught him in the quarters of another officer, implying homosexuality. Mere rumors of homosexual behavior had recently created a major scandal in Germany, and the St. Louis Post-Dispatch noted the mere fact that such charges were preferred against Captain Haynes, whether or not he was guilty, would place an ineradicable stain of shame upon the Haynes family name. She was further accusing Peter of introducing her to the third degree of Army life, where women freely indulged in drinking and smoking. When she complained, he told her that she would never be a good sport unless she joined in. The countersuit was embarrassing and seemed to deepen Peter's animosity towards Annis. The press speculated that Jenkins had told Peter that the accusations in her reply were masterminded by Annis.
The messy divorce didn't help Peter's opinion of Annis, and they would meet one more time on August 15th.
For his part, Annis seemed to be unconcerned. The Post-Dispatch reported that William B. Annis had been warned that Captain Haynes intended to kill him, but he refused to put any credence in the warning. So on Saturday, August 15th, Annis took a merry party out from the Bayside Yacht Club, Long Island, aboard his yacht, his wife being with him, and cruised about for some hours. That day, the day of the annual Bayside Yacht Club Regatta, Jenkins and Peter took a taxi to the party, where they found Annis sailing back to shore, having just finished a race. Reports differ somewhat on the exact details, but the brothers drew weapons, Jenkins apparently keeping witnesses at bay, while Peter pointed his weapon, described as a Colt revolver of the latest magazine types. Mrs. Annis shouted for her husband to look out. Leaning under the boom while Annis sat at the rudder in a swimming suit, Peter aimed and fired quickly, such that by pressing the trigger the entire load of 8 bullets was released, one after the other in a period of 5 seconds. Annis was riddled with bullets. The autopsy found 16 holes in the man's body. No bones or tissue could stop those powerful .45 caliber balls. The Evening Star added on August 17th that the weapon was new and looked as though it had never been used before. The police think Captain Haynes bought it for the sole purpose of killing Annis. The prosecution argued that he'd bought it that day. Annis survived for some time after the shooting, dying only after being brought to the hospital. In contemporary newspapers, the weapon Haynes used is consistently referred to as a Colt automatic revolver. The terms pistol and revolver were used interchangeably in this era. By modern definition, the weapon was a pistol with a magazine. The description of the weapon, along with the doctor's testimony that the bullets were .45 caliber and was fired 8 times, meant that the weapon was almost certainly the Colt automatic pistol model 1905, the first commercially available .45 caliber pistol. Despite the name, the pistol was semi-automatic and could fire 8 rounds, a 7-round magazine plus one more in the chamber, in 1.5 to 2 seconds. Only a few thousand of the model 1905 were produced before it was replaced by the more famous model 1911. The two brothers, Jenkins' weapon still drawn, waited for the police, and both were arrested. Upon their arrest, the district attorney said both brothers are unquestionably guilty of murder in the first degree, and Jenkins, initially charged with felonious assault, was later charged as an accessory. The court case that followed was one of the most closely followed in American history. The murder was audacious, in broad daylight, and directly in front of the family of the victim, and involved a prominent military family and the New York social elite. Ultimately, there would be 2 trials, the first of Jenkins Haynes as an accessory and the second of Peter. The question of the trial was whether Jenkins was guilty in abetting or even in the murder itself, and whether the crime was premeditated. The defense argued that Peter was temporarily insane, a defense called dementia americana, or the unwritten law, where men were insane just long enough to gun down the men sleeping with their wives. It had only recently been successfully used in another sensational trial, the murder of Stanford White by Harry Thaw, subject of another episode of The History Guy. General Haynes, the boy's father, was heavily involved, both in financing the defense and in projecting confidence to the public. The defense argued Peter was unstable and suggested that they would need to ascertain his fitness to stand, which seems to have inspired the move to try the 2 men separately. The Kennebec Journal of Augusta, Maine, even reported that General Haynes thought his son would not live more than 2 months, given his condition. The prosecution painted a picture of a deliberate and premeditated murder. According to witnesses, they had met with a real estate developer briefly after entering the regatta, but had asked him where Annis was. "We've got him now," one of the brothers said. Mrs. Annis testified that Jenkins had beckoned his brother when to run from the pier to the float, had preceded him, and had taken his stand to ward off interference. Charles Roberts attempted to rush Peter while he was still shooting, but was stopped by Jenkins. "Stand back," he shouted. "He knows what he's doing. Don't interfere or you'll get the same thing." When Mrs. Annis ran up the gangway, she says that she felt the revolver press against my back. Jenkins said to me, "You move and you'll get the same." Annis attempted to stand after he had been shot, but fell into the water. Friends pulled him out while Jenkins continued to point his gun about. Interestingly, despite many reports to the contrary, Mrs. Annis testified later that she had only known Peter Haynes for 4 or 5 months. The defense argued that they were only at the Regatta incidentally, seeking a real estate deal, and that seeing Annis had triggered a bout of insanity. Both Jenkins and the third brother, Major John Haynes, had repeatedly dissuaded Peter from attacking Annis. John said that if they didn't, Peter would have shot Annis a long time ago, on the same principle that I myself once shot a snake, which I found in my boot. Jenkins claimed that he only drew his weapon after the murder to protect his brother. As they waited for the police, several people accosted them. One yelled that the Army must be proud of officers like you, and accused Jenkins of preventing them from stopping the shooting. Well, what could I do? He is my brother, Jenkins replied. Another asked why they hadn't tried to commit the crime where there weren't any children around, and Jenkins replied that nobody could be more sorry for this than I. I have been trying to keep him from doing this for some time. Papers reported the shocking news that it was not the first time that Jenkins had been accused of murder. In 1891, he had gone out rowing with a friend in Baltimore, and a struggle ensued. He shot his friend through the heart. No one witnessed the scuffle, and he was acquitted, but it ruined his reputation in Baltimore. After his arrest in 1908, the lawyer who had tried him in 1891 told reporters that Jenkins was one of the most dangerous men that he has ever known. It came out during the trial that Jenkins himself had trouble with Annis after sending a story into his magazine, which Annis had recommended against. Jenkins wrote a letter to the magazine claiming that he knew why the story was rejected, that he would get even with Annis yet. According to the South Bend Tribune, just after Claudia had signed the confession, Jenkins wrote the magazine telling the editor that he had Annis under a criminal charge, and he was a scoundrel. Shortly after the murder, Joseph Shea, the Haynes lawyer, claimed that he had a source. A member of the bar of the Supreme Court, an ex-diplomat and an old friend of the Haynes family, would attack Annis's character, making him out to be a boaster of conquest among women, an absinthe drinker, a detractor of the United States Army, and an unscrupulous man in the pursuit of his daily business duties. The source also alleged that on 3 occasions within 2 months of his death, he talked to me of his contempt for Mr. Haynes. According to him, Annis said that Haynes is going to kill me. I'm going to shoot him on sight, before denouncing all U.S. Army posts and impugning the morality of American Army officers and also their wives. But the unknown source was never named and ultimately didn't testify. Though the first trial was about Jenkins, much of the evidence and testimony focused instead on Peter. The defense tried to argue over Peter's mental state and presented the testimony of a servant of the household who reported on the alleged affair between Annis and Claudia. They tested the pistol, and the defense argued that once it began firing, the action cannot be stopped, to argue that Peter made a split-second decision. The Buffalo Inquirer reported the whole magazine fired in 1 3/8 seconds. The defense also presented a witness with a differing account of what Jenkins had said during the shooting. Instead of a threat, it was a warning. Keep back, he's crazy. He doesn't know what he's doing, and if you interfere, you may get the same thing. Meanwhile, the prosecution sought to prove that Jenkins Haynes declared that he approved of the killing, that he objected to an officer taking his brother to the dying man for identification, admitting that we killed Annis, and that he deserved the electric chair. One witness even claims that Jenkins said, "Stand back, I'm running this affair." Another alleged that Jenkins had said that if it were him, "I'd like to go to hell and drag Annis out and kill him again." A mess of conflicting statements from witnesses poured in. Jenkins had or had not tried to leave before the shooting. He had been looking for a Jesperson in pursuit of a real estate dealings. He had or hadn't called for policemen. Most important was laying the groundwork for Peter's claim that he was insane at the time of the murder, but had recovered his reason. The trial, which began on December 16th, stretched over Christmas. Jenkins himself testified on January 4th, and his testimony was mostly about Peter's mental state. In his description of the killing, he had walked away from Peter, only to turn back to find him gone. He denied saying any of what witnesses claimed, or ever aiming the gun at Mrs. Annis. An alienist, what they then called a psychiatrist, claimed that Peter's insanity began when he heard the name Annis and ended when he shot him. When the decision finally went to the jury, the judge instructed them to pay no heed to the insanity testimony, and that the question of Peter's sanity wasn't relevant to Jenkins' possible guilt. The defense's closing argument was described as a fierce denunciation of homewreckers by the New York Times. "What one of you 12 men would not transgress the law and slay the man who ruined your daughter," Shea said. The jury deliberated all night, and believing that they were deadlocked, the judge called them to ask if they believed that they could come up with a verdict in 24 hours, when the jury surprised the whole courtroom by declaring that they had found him not guilty. The uproar was so loud that John Haynes, outside of the courthouse, sprinted inside. The New York Times reported hundreds quickly crowded about the courthouse, watching what the paper described as a shocking failure of justice. Jenkins declared that he would write a novel based on the unwritten law. It seemed that dementia Americana had won again. But the story wasn't over. It wasn't until April 19th that Peter went on trial. Jury selection took more than a week, and the testimony that followed largely repeated what had been said in the previous trial. The central argument of both sides was over insanity. Men do such acts out of passion, the prosecution said in their closing speech. But if insanity should be held up as a defense whenever murder were committed, there would never be any punishment for it. Part of the argument was that Peter had a weak mind, which began with a blow to the head when he was a child. The defense's legal team, on the other hand, declared that the slaying was merely an act of God. The trial continued to make headlines, and at one point the judge reprimanded Jenkins Haynes for his theatrical manner of testifying. The defense asked a 14,000-word hypothetical question to one of their alienist witnesses, who claimed that Peter suffered from impulsive insanity. At least 3 other experts testified that he was sane. On May 11th, after only 4 ballots and 3 hours, the jury announced the verdict: guilty of manslaughter in the first degree. This was something of a compromise, not murder in the first degree, which could have come with the death penalty. Instead, he faced at most 20 years. The Hayneses said they planned to appeal on errors in the course of the trial, but they didn't ultimately appeal. On May 18th, Peter was sentenced to 8 to 16 years at Sing Sing. In 1911, he was finally granted an absolute divorce from Claudia, with her confession as evidence. The Army was in a peculiar position and for some time was reportedly unable to get Peter off their rolls, despite the fact that he was in prison. He finally resigned, effective January 28, 1911. In September of 1910, the New York Times reported that General Haynes had submitted a petition to New York Governor Charles Hughes for a pardon for his son. The general had to work at it, but a year later, on October 3, 1911, a new governor, John Dix, granted Peter his pardon, after serving only 2 years of his sentence. All of the men who convicted him on the jury signed the petition for his pardon.
Despite all the allegations, it was never really clear that Mrs. Haynes and Annis were having an affair. Claudia never publicly admitted to infidelity beyond that contested confession, and Mrs. Annis always denied that her husband had been unfaithful. The case was important to American law. It was among the last times that this supposed unwritten law was used as a defense for murder. It caused some reform in how testimony was allowed for alienists, preventing non-experts from suggesting novel conditions from the stand. And the conviction of Peter Haynes at least set the standard that even if a man was involved in an affair, that you couldn't simply murder him without consequence. And while Jenkins Haynes escaped the conviction, the whole case damaged his reputation in the publishing world, and so he was no longer published in the best magazines, and it's perhaps because of that that what is arguably his most famous story was actually published under a pseudonym. In 1912, he published a short story in a magazine that was called The Popular Magazine under the pseudonym Captain Maine Clue Garnet, that was named The White Ghost of Disaster. It's a story about a supposedly unsinkable ship that hits an iceberg on one of its first voyages and sinks, and is most famous because of an eerie coincidence. The story was published on April 7th, 1912, just a week before the sinking of the Titanic. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. Hi, Strudel. Oh, you're purring. Yay.